All right, Chris. So thanks for coming on the show and taking a Friday morning to talk to me. I know we were talking off the mic, but I do get a lot of people that are asking me things about what's going on with cannabis. Until it really hit New Jersey, it was more CBD and stuff like that. But I guess you see what's going on in the country. So I'd like to have a discussion about that from a business standpoint, and how people can get started and what do you see happening in the industry. But maybe we can go back to your background and how you got started in business and what your training is and how you got to doing this, running these publications specifically for cannabis. But
Yeah, it's not what I ever envisioned I'd be doing. So I went to college in Colorado and had my share of cannabis
I'm
experience.
sure.
I was never super into it, but definitely used it occasionally. And then you graduate and you move on. And so I actually was a journalism major, and I worked at newspapers in Colorado, covering business industries,
Okay.
from high tech to the skiing industry to sports business, and really kind of carved out my path in journalism as a reporter and an editor. And I moved to South Korea in 2009 because I live abroad, and I just wanted to try something different. And when I left Denver, before that I was working on a newspaper. We were covering the business community here, and we weren't covering marijuana at all. There was no industry to
Of
cover.
course not. It was illegal, right?
Yeah, right.
It was illegal drugs.
Yeah. So they had legalized medical at one point here, medical marijuana, but it wasn't an industry. There wasn't anything going on. So I moved to South Korea and spent 2 years there working for a newspaper affiliated with the New York Times. And I came back in 2011. And I came back to Denver, and there, in just that 2 year period I was gone, there were more dispensaries in Denver than Starbucks.
Now, was that medical only at that point?
It was only medical.
Yeah.
And it was one of the first, handful of states where entrepreneurs, the states had legalized medical, and they said, we're going to try this out, right? So they were opening up storefronts, dispensaries, and they were cultivating marijuana, and they were taking these chances. And it was just this very short period of time, and all of a sudden there was this industry here, and there were actual storefronts that you could see.
Right.
And they were weird at that time. They were, there was no regulations. And so it was what you would expect, right? There's a big pot leaf in a window, and there were people with signs, spinning signs on corners saying, half price joints. It wasn't the best representation of a medical industry. But at that time, I was kind of rethinking my career, because the media industry, was basically terrible since I got in it in 2000. With Craigslist and the internet was kind of eroding the business models of media companies. So I was tired of seeing layoffs everywhere and always wondering what was going to happen at the places I worked. So I was getting my MBA, and two women who had made their way in other media, in banking and marketing, basically wanted to launch this trade publication for cannabis professionals. And so, at that time, cannabis professionals is kind of a euphemism, and I'm not dissing on the people that started businesses then, but at that time, it was really people who had an affinity for cannabis.
Right.
And maybe they,
we use other words to refer to them.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe they were growing it in their basement.
Well, I would think there wasn't a growing industry, right? At that point, right?
It was
people
all
had to grow in Colorado.
Right. And so, the people that didn't have a ton of business experience, most of them. And so where the opportunity was helping professionalize the industry, helping the people who were pioneering this brand new area of business, to actually run their businesses like a company, and think of things like shelf space, and how do I market and advertise, and how do I grow my business and expand. And so they wanted to start this publication, and they hired me to help launch it. And that became MJ Biz, and our main media site, which is MJ Biz Daily. And we took with my background in journalism, in serious business journalism, we brought an approach to an industry that didn't have it. So it was objectivity, like real quality journalism and analysis of news and developments, and then also case studies and typical like kind of B2B type information. So that's how this whole thing started. And for me personally, I just saw it as a business opportunity,
Right.
to help this fledgling industry and see where it went.
Okay. All right. So obviously it was just medical at that point.
Yeah.
And that was 2011. So how do you get started? Like it was a startup magazine basically, right?
It was a startup, basically a website.
Okay. So it was electronic magazine, I guess, right? It was a
Yeah,
digital version, or you can read it online.
You read it online, and I was just writing stories about the industry. And as any entrepreneur knows, anyone in business at a high level, there's a major pivot or two along the way, right? So we set out to, we were going to do like reports and case studies, and like I said, how do you stock your shelves, and really like insider business type information and intelligence. And as what happened is, at that time, the business model wasn't materializing. None of these people would pay for any type of information like that.
Right.
And there weren't a lot of advertisers either, who would then help fund a revenue model built around that. So is what we learned is we shifted to more of the news and analysis side, because this was an industry starved for information, like good quality information about what the heck is going on, right? There's regulations and there's potential federal
operators, you mean?
Yeah. And so we switched to more of a news and analysis focus, and then we decided that the industry needed a place to gather, like a professional trade show. So I was doing the research, and I would go to medical marijuana conferences, right? And it would be a show floor full of booths, people peddling bongs and rolling papers and t-shirts and posters.
Yeah, they subscribe to High Times, things like that.
Yeah, and there's women in bikinis, holding bongs.
Right. But was Colorado at that time the only state where there was any kind of legal use, or there were other states? That's why there were these trade shows developing?
There were these other states, California, Montana, Washington. So these Western states had previously legalized medical cannabis. It kind of sat there, and then kind of collectively over a short period, people started opening businesses and saying, okay, it's legal in my state. I'm just going to see what happens and try and do this. So it was just medical in about a dozen states at that time.
Okay. So I understand. I think I understand the model. If you're printing a magazine or you're distributing it, right, you're going based on subscribership, so you can then get advertisers. But that's what I was thinking, like, who's going to advertise? Like, nobody can, who are you trying to reach? That marketplace? Or I guess it would be a real hard fit for the people that want to associate with it, right?
Yeah. And I think the original business model, we were going to, develop some type of subscription offering for the business owners and the entrepreneurs and the investors, with quality content and information that they would pay for, less reliant on advertising. But we were trying to explore where the revenue would come from. We just saw an opportunity. So we said, let's put our foot in this, right? And start building the audience, start building a business, and see where we go and see where the revenue potential is.
Right.
And we found the real revenue potential in those early days. And it's still a big part of our revenue stream, was these live, professionally run business events for people in the industry, where you can have a show floor and you have exhibitors, not with weed on the show floor. Right. These are, because you can't do that, right? So it's consulting services, technology, lighting equipment for the grows, real estate agents were getting in and helping these companies, lawyers, all over the board. And then it was really bringing them together for education. So the operators, are getting together and meeting each other in a professional setting and learning from each other. So like any trade show, if anyone's been there, a lot of people have been to trade shows in their industry. That's the model we took in this one, which didn't have it at that time.
Right. Well, I would think a lot of these people weren't really business owners, right? They weren't attracted to the industry at that time because they were entrepreneurs and they were small. They were in the industry, like you said. They were cannabis users. They liked, the medicinal properties of cannabis or whatever. They were early entrants to the marketplace, right? So they didn't necessarily go out and write a business plan. Like now, I don't know about every state, but with the CRC in New Jersey, you have to submit a business plan and all this kind of stuff. I would assume then you didn't have to do that, right?
No, I mean, there were very few statewide regulations or citywide regulations anywhere.
Yeah.
So the states didn't know what was going on either. And they're like, well, it's legal here. And now we've got businesses and we don't have any structure for them. And so, yeah, people were starting businesses. They're just saying, hey, I'm going to grow some marijuana. I'm spending, there was one who became big in Denver, and I think they started with $10,000 and they started growing. And then they started, they got a cheap storefront in a dilapidated area. And then they just built it from there, and they became very legit. They became, faces of the industry over time because they did it right. But again, you could start really simply, and it wasn't people with a hardcore business or entrepreneurship background coming in.
Right.
And there were very low barriers. The biggest barrier was the risk you were taking personally.
Right. It wasn't like you had municipal approvals you needed and licensing. You had to have investors and not like it is now.
Yeah, and it's been a sea change in the past decade, but at that time, that was the landscape, and no one knew where the industry was going. And in fact, after about, I think 7 months after we started, when I talked about pivots earlier, there were crackdowns by the federal government in states like California, some in Colorado, some in Washington, Montana, and basically DEA agents would go into these stores and raid them. And no one was really going to jail, but they were taking all their marijuana, and the place shut down, right? And it was really unclear on what was going on. So there were raids. And so we, at that point, towards the end of 2011, said, we don't know if this is even going to be an industry going forward.
Really?
Yes, because I think there were at one point, there was 500 raids, over a certain period of time in California and these states that I mentioned before. So we said, if the federal government chooses to really crack down, this whole thing.
Right. I guess that was more of a question mark at the point. Yeah.
And so as what we did is I actually, because the overarching umbrella company had, other kind of B2B trade publications in other industries. That's how that was started. This was one of those. I actually I was the only person really working on this, MJ Biz, the cannabis industry. I took a foot out of it and I started exploring other options for us to start similar things in different industries. So, I looked at things for doctors and veterinarians,
Sure.
And that's where we were. And it was like, well, let's keep our toe in this just in case, right? And keep it going, but let's have a plan B here, where we're going to pivot and maybe go into a completely different direction.
Yeah. So I guess at that point, because of what was going on the federal level, it wasn't so clear that it would become legal. Adult use would become legal, recreational use would become legal, because you didn't know what was going to happen on the federal level. It's still illegal at the federal level, but they've been quiet about it.
We didn't know if the medical marijuana industry would exist out there in the open, not underground, under a state law, let alone, recreational marijuana was a topic that advocates were pushing for and lobbyists. But honestly, at that time, I was like, oh, hell no, that's not happening. Like
it's just going to be medical use,
side.
Right?
Yeah.
That's and so your publication was really the first business publication in the industry.
Absolutely. And that's the approach we took. And again, I had a really solid background in business journalism. At the time, any information out there, most of it was, what you'd expect, some dude in his basement, railing on the government and writing a blog. Like there was no serious coverage, or the mainstream media, would have pot pun headlines,
right,
8 months and say, this weird thing going on, Rocky Mountain High, they were just like poking fun at it, basically. So if you can put yourself in that situation, you're trying to actually run a business in this, there was nowhere to go. There were no resources that were really quality at that time to understand the landscape, to understand the news and the developments. And then also to get together in a more professional setting. So you're sitting down, not talking about the type of weed you want to smoke, you're sitting down talking about how you improve your profit margins.
Right. Well, that's what business owners need to do, right?
Exactly. But it wasn't that wasn't there at the time.
Right. Well, there was also no barriers to entry, right? Because which is something I definitely want to talk about. It's much more difficult to get started now in a cannabis business, even in a state where it's already legal and they've developed regulations. I think a lot of people don't realize that when you legalize something like that, the government gets involved. Obviously, they want their piece, right? They're going to tax it. They're going to set up their regulations. And it's not for the average Joe to say, oh, I want to open a dispensary, right? Because they don't look, I get business owners that don't realize a lot of things that they should be doing, like getting municipal approvals and getting licenses. Forget about the fact that, if it's cannabis, the regulations are, not only through the roof, but being argued about all the time and changing and adjusting. And we don't even have an application in New Jersey. Nobody knows what it's going to look like. They think it's going to look like the medical one. And they haven't been. So I guess in Colorado, they were it was easy to open a medical dispensary, right? At the time, there weren't a lot of.
It was at first, and it was in many states at first because there were no regulations. And what happened is in a very short period of time, lawmakers and the public saw what was happening, and there was kind of a backlash, as you can see, if you've got sign spinners and you're driving your kid to school, and there's a free joints and there's billboards. So what happened is this was totally uncharted territory. So states and cities went back and said, whoa, what's going on? We need to have regulations around this. So then you have this wave of states coming and saying, okay. Here's what you need to do. We're going to let the voters approve this, and we're going to abide by the will of the voters. Then we may not be happy about it, but we're going to establish a structure for this industry. And that's when you saw the advent of regulatory systems cropping up that in some cases, in many cases, required licensing. Not all of them right away, but so yes, it went from an unregulated Wild West to a still Wild West scenario, but with some structure around it in most states that had legalized at that point. Except the big exception was California, which actually did not introduce regulations on medical marijuana until a couple years ago. And so they were in this period for many years of, having no statewide regulations, even just a couple years ago. So, but anyways, that's kind of.
You mean you could just open a store as long as somebody had a medical marijuana card and you can sell it to them?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Strange situation. And that's the biggest cannabis market, basically in the world. So it was really unorganized, and it actually gave the industry a black eye over time as states did regulate it, and they showed that you can do this well, right? And you can create something that does help people, that creates business opportunities, and it has a framework around it. And if that framework is there and it's enforced and there's oversight, this is a legit business opportunity. It's a legitimate, path forward to help people. Like there's a lot of benefits to it if you do it right. California was sitting here, not regulating the industry, and people would go there and say, well, that shop, I see shops everywhere, right? And there's people hanging out front, and there's bars on the window, and then you go to like a Colorado with regulations and it feels like a medical clinic. This was a couple of years ago. Recreational has changed this even further in different ways, which I'm happy to discuss at any point.
Yeah. I got a lot of questions all over the place, but so I guess with the uncertainty at the federal level, right, there's only certain things you can do. Like you can't cross state lines, right? Because now you're in interstate commerce and you're subject to federal jurisdiction. So you don't have like growers in Colorado selling to dispensaries in New Jersey. So what does that do to the industry? How does that affect on the federal level, affect the business side of it, state to state?
Yeah, what you saw, and this was one of our business challenges in growing this company, was at first there was, companies were really just focused on their immediate market because of the reasons you said. And also because cities started putting their own regulations on top of whatever the state was doing. So in one city, the regulations might be different than another in terms of what's allowed or how you can operate. So you couldn't even really expand beyond your city in many cases. So you were just like one shop, mom and pops. It's the retailers, it's the cultivation, it's the infused products, and the processing of the plant. There's different verticals in this industry. Some people were doing all of them, some people were just doing one. But the bottom line is, if you were touching and handling the plant, which we do as a company, but if you were doing that, expanding across city lines was difficult. Expanding across state lines was even more difficult because, for the reasons you mentioned, you can't ship marijuana across state lines. So what happened is you had this evolution where, and it's still going on today, where the companies are finding ways around this, and you're seeing a rise of chains of multi-state operators, as we call them in the industry, that are they're building national brands, and they're doing it by licensing deals with other companies and partnerships, and using their brand and their name and their SOPs and their processes to expand into other states. And then you also have them now taking what they've done in a particular state and then replicating that elsewhere by winning a license in Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, and maybe they started in Colorado. You have companies now that are in, a dozen or more states, and they're building brands. And so you can go into, XYZ shop in Colorado, and you can go to XYZ shop in Oregon, and it's the same experience. So like we're all used to with a McDonald's or a Starbucks.
Right. But you can't have centralized distribution. So if you have a company selling now in New Jersey, they also have to open either a growing facility or find somebody who could grow for them.
Yeah, and you can imagine the challenges in that, because you're hooking up with partners and people you don't know as well, and you're trying to make sure it's produced the same way. Maybe you're making infused gummies, right? Gummies, and now you got to make sure the sourcing of the sugar and the materials is right, and the process is done, and you can't have that centralized manufacturing or distribution.
Right. Okay. So because I see a lot of the issues of, because what was I going to say? It seems to me that the growing side of the business is high risk, because if you don't know what you're doing, you kill your plants and you lost all your inventory, and then you don't have anything to sell. It's not like, there's not a lot of market risk, right? Once there's dispensaries, there's clearly going to be a demand once they work that part out. But I would think that if you kill your crop and you don't know what you're doing, there's a lot of risk to that, right?
Well, there's a lot of risk in many, many ways, and that's definitely one of them. I'll share a quick anecdote that highlights this. So I have a podcast called Seed to CEO. I interviewed Jim Belushi. He has actually opened a cannabis farm in Oregon, and he's actually out there. And I think your listeners know, Belushi of the Belushi family, and so he actually pivoted to cannabis, and he still acts and sings and is in the Blues Brothers, but he opened a cannabis farm, and it's licensed, and he's out there chasing gophers, and he's like learning how to grow marijuana. And he didn't know, he saw the opportunity to, as he says, help people. But you know what he did? He didn't know what he was doing, and he had growers, and they left for the day, and he went in and he went to finish some stuff up and spray them with some chemicals to make sure, or whatever, to make sure they were okay and could grow healthy. And he left the lights on overnight.
And he didn't know that would kill the plant.
He ruined, and this was his premier strain, like a premier type of cannabis he was growing that he was hinging his company on. And he came back the next day, and they were all dead. So to your point, it does happen. He has a bankroll to get past that, right?
Right. Well, he does, right.
Right.
Yeah. You don't think about that stuff.
There's a lot of challenges. And for us, as a business, we don't touch the plant in any form. It's not on our show floors. So we were able to expand nationally,
obviously, right.
Yeah. So we held our first trade show in Denver in 2012, right? And at that time, there were regulations in Denver, but it was still this strange industry to everyone's, right? So the hotels wouldn't take us. They wouldn't give us a space. And so we got in this old...
Really?
Yeah. They
wasn't like you were going to get 35,000 people in the room and everyone was going to get high.
Yeah. Well, that's the thinking was, we don't want a marijuana conference, at our hotel or venue if there's people walking by or kids.
Right.
And that's just, I just want to say that because I'll show you how much this industry has changed and how many more business opportunities there are because of acceptance and growth. But we ended up in an old Masonic lodge that became an event venue. And we had around 400 attendees that time. I wore a suit and tie. I gave the keynote, opening speech, and people dressed up more so for this, but I was one of the only in a suit and tie, right?
Right.
But it was professional. We had maybe 35 exhibitors, and that was and we thought that was a massive success, right? And this was supposed to be a national conference too. And so, just to give you an idea of how this industry has changed, in 2019, our last in-person show, we had 35,000 business people attending in the Las Vegas Convention Center. So we moved from not being able to get a venue because it wasn't publicly accepted to being in one of the most prominent convention centers in the world and being embraced and accepted by them. Yeah. They're eager to help us grow. So that's kind of what we've navigated as a business. And that's how this whole industry has really exploded, over the past 10 years.
Yeah. So you run that trade show. That's your trade show?
Yeah. It's called MJ BizCon. And, one other thing is we try to get keynotes, right? From every conference has a keynote to draw people in and give them good advice. And in the early days, it was people in the industry, and then we're like, well, let's get some people from outside, right? You want a bigger name. And we had a really hard time getting anyone who would give a business keynote, right, at a cannabis conference. So, but over the years, we've been able to get, as this has spread, we've had Ralph Nader, we had Penn Jillette, we had this year we have Damon John. He's on Shark Tank. He started
right.
Ubu, right? We had Kevin O'Leary at one of our events, also on Shark Tank. So that just shows you how much things have changed from those days 10 years ago when there were raids. The businesses in it didn't even know if there was going to be a future.
Now, do guys like that, like Kevin O'Leary, Damon Johns, things, are they invested in the industry? That you know of?
I mean, Kevin O'Leary felt that it was he sees the potential, and I don't know if he has since. This was about 2.5 years ago that he spoke at our event, but he saw the potential, but he brought a healthy dose of outside perspective to an industry that might not have been ready for it. Because he said, look, if you are running your business and it's all about the plant and it's all about the people and it's all about the culture, he's like, you're going to get rolled over when the big businesses come in. And he's like, and they will come in when
they are, right.
And they are now, right? And even since he said that, we've seen another wave. But it was interesting because the industry wasn't ready for that message. But as the sophistication comes in and the expertise and the money, that changes the ballgame considerably.
All right. So this is a small business podcast, entrepreneurs podcast, and I am a small business attorney. So I'm not dealing with, the large companies, whether it's in this industry or not. I'm dealing with the small business owner. I'm dealing with the guy who opens the shop and needs zoning approval and so forth. He may bring in some investors, but do you see, where do you see this industry going? And I'll give you an example. I read the regulations in New Jersey. So New Jersey, as people listening, and right, we had medical marijuana that was approved, but it was still it was very on a very short leash. They had like 6
very
dispensaries. And I don't even think they were all open. It was a lot of controversial politics. And then they eventually passed. First, they tried to make marijuana legal, adult use, and then that didn't work. So then they put a referendum out and whatever. So now it's legal, but it's still part of the regulation. There's a micro business carve out for minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and veteran-owned businesses, I think because of the concern of a big business coming in and because of money and networks and forcing out the little guy. So what do you see happening, in the industry from that standpoint? Is it viable for a small business owner to have a shop, or do you see it all going to be big business at some point?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially for your listener base. I think what we saw is that a lot of the states that have legalized more recently in the past couple of years have learned from what's happened in other states, where you did see this whole industry was built on mom and pops, like many industries, right? And then that started to change, and we all know how that story can play out, and it's starting to play out in cannabis. So
sure,
newer states, including New York, as they legalized recreational marijuana, have looked at this. They've listened to the industry. They've listened to people, which I give them a lot of credit for. It's easy to criticize these programs and the legislators that are figuring it out. But what you're seeing, especially on the East Coast, the eastern part of the country, is they are seeing what is happening, and they are saying the smaller people are getting pushed out as this goes forward. The regulations in our states have become so expensive and onerous. Sometimes it costs over $1 million to win a license and set up a cultivation operation.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that's not small business, right? That's people with access.
You got to bring in outside investors. You got,
yeah.
You got to do things the small business owners don't normally do, like raising capital. Yeah.
Yeah. And as what you also have is that the licensing process, to get a license to operate one of these businesses, now you're competing against these multi-state chains that have the experience, they have the money, and they're coming in and they're dominating the licensing application process, and they're gobbling them all up. So you see states like New Jersey that are recognizing that's going on and saying, okay, this should not be controlled by just a couple big companies. So they are carving out, opportunities for small businesses, veteran-owned. There's social equity is a massive thing in this industry. States are trying to, dedicate a certain allotment of licenses or give extra points or whatever it is to social equity candidates, because that's another problem the industry has experienced, right? most of the people going to jail in the past for marijuana, were minorities. And now you have a bunch of white middle-aged dudes like myself, right, that are in this industry and benefiting from it.
Right.
So there's been a recognition that that's not good, a good situation. So in New Jersey, New York, these other states, they're looking at issues like this and saying, how do we make sure that this industry is equitable and that there's opportunities for people across the spectrum, including the big companies, but also everyone in between to the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah, I think there's a limit in New Jersey. They're talking about that you can't transfer your license for 18 months or something. So they don't want people to just get bought out. And that's another thing that would happen, right? If you manage to get a license and you're a small business owner, and they'll offer you a crap load of money.
And that's what you've seen in other states. Again, so they're looking and they're saying, yeah, you can have a secondary market for licenses in some states that are like, you just get the license, right? And then you sell it and you can retire.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, ultimately, if I was able to open a chain of dispensaries, that would be my exit plan. I would look to sell out to larger corporations or somebody who's rolling up small. But I know there are issues with that, right? You can't just transfer the license. You have to have, at least in New Jersey, what I'm seeing, maybe you can tell me what goes on in other states. You have to have municipal, the municipality's got to be on board, because especially nowadays, right? They don't all want it in their backyard. And a lot of downtowns and a lot of municipalities have opted out of the legislation in New Jersey. I'm sure you see a lot of that stuff, right? So is it viable to build a business, a chain of locations where you're going from one to the other and you're like, let's open here, here, and here. And four of them are like, no, you can't. It seems to be a lot of politics that you have to play to get these things done.
There is, but every state that's doing this is still an experiment, right? And they don't know that there isn't a blueprint to do this, and there isn't one agreed upon way to structure an industry and the regulations. So is what you have is every state has done it differently, and they might pick and choose, hey, this seemed to work over in this state, this didn't work here. But you go to Colorado, the regulations are different from Oregon, they're different from Oklahoma, they're different from Florida. And so, in New Jersey, they're still working through a lot of that process, right? And that's part of the difficulties of getting involved in a new market. If you're starting a business, there's a period of extreme uncertainty, and you don't know how this is going to play out. And there's usually back and forth, and there's changes and there's delays. And so the final picture in New Jersey is still a ways out until we really understand how this is going to work. But in other states, again, it's so different. It depends on the state and what's possible. I will tell you, with recreational, you often see initially a larger portion of communities that say, okay, we're not going to do this, or we're going to put a moratorium on it. That's not rare. Is what happens is the bigger cities usually move forward with it. And maybe all the rural areas don't. So like from that standpoint, it looks like, wow, no one in the state is allowing it, but it's usually the bigger population centers that do go forward with it. And then in some cases that trickles out. The other cities and municipalities say, hey, this isn't as bad as we thought.
Well, that's the vision, right? They think there's going to be potheads on every corner, smoking and stuff. And that, I think that's probably true with liquor back when prohibition was lifted, and people are like, well, we don't want people drunk sleeping in the streets, but it didn't happen,
Yeah. Well, hey, it's happening now in some cases with alcohol. So,
right. Of course it is. But I think most of the stuff, and you can give me your opinion on it, that people are worried about, that local people are worried about, is probably not going to come to fruition, in terms of the things that they think it's going to do harm to their community.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to put the rosiest shine on this industry. I come from a journalism background, right? So I'm skeptical. I try and be honest, straightforward. Right. And I can tell you, when I came in the industry, I didn't know what it was going to be like. I just saw the business opportunity, and I always said from day one, like, if this proves to have an overly negative effect on people, communities, humanity, like, I'm out. Like, I'm not just trying to get a buck wherever I can. Like, I couldn't sleep at night. And what we've seen is, all these fears, like, and I am not from the marijuana background. I think that's important to say again, because I'm not like, this plant's like a
rah type of,
like, I'm looking at it objectively. And it's what I'm seeing over time is, especially on the medical side, there are tons and tons of medical uses that have not been explored by science. So it's anecdotal, right? It's all the people. So it's hard to back it up, right? But I know people of all age ranges and all conditions that have benefited significantly from medical cannabis, from the mainstream professional world all the way to, you name it. And on the recreational side, I think that's where the big fear is, right? Like you said, are there going to be, stoners walking around, eating Funyuns and, bumping into each other. And I'll tell you, like, look, there are parts of the effect on the community we just don't know yet, right? Because it's still fairly new. But what we've seen is that's not the case. I mean, come to Denver and you'll see what a regulated market looks like. You go into a recreational store and it looks like an Apple store, right? And it's all high tech and it's nice. You go to the one in Vegas, Planet 13, and it's got like a light up floor that's awesome. They've got these robotic balloons. It's really professional, right? It's fun. It's hip. It looks like anything else. And so the more people are around it, that's why we're seeing legalization spread, right? Because it's not having that negative effect. And people are saying, look, there's business opportunities. There's taxes for the municipalities. People are accepting of it now. They don't even see what the big deal is. Use it, and it brings benefits to people, whether it's just relaxing, maybe they're not using alcohol or opioids as much, whatever,
taking stress medication and that type of stuff.
It's not a panacea, and there are issues. There's still illicit market issues, but in general, the best way I can back this up is to say, look at the pace of legalization. If this industry was destroying communities and had all the negative effects,
it wouldn't keep going in this direction.
It would not keep going, and it's going into red states too, which I mentioned because it's the blue states, it's the kind of liberal mentality that adopted this and got it going forward, right?
Right.
But now you're seeing in public opinion poll after public opinion poll, no matter who does it, you can have Fox News do it, you can have CNN.
Right.
It's clear, right? Over 90% of Americans think that medical cannabis should be legal. And over 60% think some form, or recreational is legal. So, I mean, it should be allowed. So basically it's like, and you're seeing that play out at the ballot box. South Dakota, a deep red state, became the first state in the election. It legalized both medical and recreational at the same time.
Wow.
Most states start with medical, then eventually there might be.
Yeah, of course. It's the open the door and you get started and then you figure it out. And they don't want to open the floodgates. There's only like 12 people that live in South Dakota, right? So it's a little bit easier to control.
So they got up to 7 supporting it and got the majority. No, but Oklahoma's a red state, and that's like a burgeoning medical marijuana market. So is what you're seeing is a spread across party lines. It's spreading across geographical lines, and that's really what's showing you that all these negative effects just aren't there. And in fact, the benefits are what people are seeing.
Yeah, how many states are at least medical? Is medical legal in?
There's 38. It's almost
a lot.
It's 2/3 of the country.
And how many of those have recreational use?
19.
Yeah, so that's more than half.
Yeah, well, yeah,
about half. Yeah, about half. Yeah,
and including, well, the funny thing is, including, people don't realize that Washington D.C. itself,
right?
Not the federal government. Washington D.C. has legalized both medical and recreational, and you can buy it there like a mile from the Department of Justice, which enforces federal drug laws. It's just a strange situation that it's federally illegal, and you have the vast majority of the country, has legalized cannabis in some fashion at a state level. So most of the population lives in a state that has legalized,
right, at some form.
Yeah.
Some form. All right. So let's talk about getting started. So somebody, I could see if you're like in the CBD, industry, maybe you have a CBD shop or whatever, that this would be a natural kind of a progression. But if you're a small business owner and you're looking around, and I do deal with a lot of small business owners where they buy a business and they build it up and they sell it, and they're different industries. They're not specific to one industry. How does one just get started? If it is something they're interested in, they think it's a viable opportunity, which I think we're both in agreement on financially. I mean, how do you get started? You have to move to a state where it is. What do you do?
Now, here's the biggest misconception of someone looking at this industry initially, and looking to see if there's a play. Like we've been talking about the plant touching part, right?
Right.
And people might be out there, your listeners might be saying, well, I don't know how to grow anything. I don't retail, right?
I can't even grow a house plant. I'm going to grow.
I know. I killed my cactus,
exactly.
And I don't know how to develop a chocolate bar with marijuana in it. Right. So, that's the thing, is there's a huge ecosystem around this business. And we call them ancillary companies, but it's very obvious once I say it. It's all the services and products that support the actual core of the industry.
Right.
And it's big. It is big. We're billions of dollars. It's what we do, right? It's ancillary companies that serve the industry. And, is what I would recommend is look at your skill set. What if you have a current business, what do you do? If you have a current professional career, what do you do? And lean into that. So if you run a marketing business, right? Well, guess what? The industry needs a lot of marketing help now. There's a lot of challenges, and the companies are still maturing and they're not as sophisticated. So guess what? There's a play here. There's a play in, legal, consulting. There's marketing, advertising, HR. There's, again, lighting. So what you have is a lot of mainstream companies. We use the word mainstream a lot. So it's basically everything but cannabis, right?
They don't sell the product.
Yeah,
they just they support the industry.
They support the industry, but you have a lot of mainstream companies that have built their businesses in other industries that said, this industry needs the same type of thing we provide. And so we're going to do, real estate agents, engineers, like the list goes on and on. Basically any type of product or service or skill set that's needed in any other industry is needed here, because it is an industry. It's a business, right?
Right.
And it's vast. It's that supply chain, again, is from the cultivation. So anyone involved in agriculture or anything that serves that community has an opportunity. And then you've got processing, where you need equipment to extract oils. So there's extraction machines, and then there's, it goes all the way to the, retail side, developing products. You're seeing CPG companies get in now because there's branded products, right? So you can just
CPG.
See, consumer packaged goods, like the big
got it. Okay.
brands like the Nestle and the, and so is what's happening is you can look at this that way. Just say, here's an industry that needs basically everything another industry needs. So how does my expertise fit into that? And literally you can find a path into it in any way. And you don't even have to touch the plant, which allows you to offer a national, have a national footprint.
As long as you're not touching the plant. So you're a glass blower and you're making, bongs, and my son's in college, so he teaches me all this stuff, and the bowls and the stems and all that stuff. Some of these guys are really talented. The glass blowers, really talented. Absolutely. But they can sell anywhere, right? There's no restriction on selling a glass beaker somewhere.
Well, and also think of it broad, like tech, right? So now we have there's apps, right? And they're delivery apps, and there's apps for consumers so they understand what they're getting, and there is software and systems and platforms for the dispensaries for POS, right, to track their sales and then get that data and figure out what's going on with their overall transactions and their customer base. It's everything. It's everything in retail. It's everything in agriculture. It's everything in products, and it's everything that a consumer would want, because there's ways to target the consumer directly as well, and patients. So that's what I would say. I would say start there. Yes, there are opportunities in the licensed area of this industry, but they are difficult. So if you're thinking of hoping to open a dispensary or a products company or a grow site, your first step is spending a lot of time learning about the industry. Even if you have a background in those areas, like, I've run a restaurant or a retail store. Right. Trust me, the biggest mistake people make is that they think what they did over here will fit exactly in cannabis. You need to start with learning about the industry, especially in your state, how it works, what the regulations are, and what it's all about, just how the whole thing operates, and then getting a wider perspective. And a lot of people skip that step. I mean, it sounds obvious to learn about it, but people think they know more than they do, or they don't realize what they don't know. And it's a different industry. It developed differently, it's still federally illegal. So it's a whole new ball game. So you can't just jump in and say, I'm going to go, try and win this license and pay $5,000. Here we go. Finger. Like, you need to understand what you're doing, and you need to understand how the industry works.
Yeah. And a lot of people do that in all kinds of industries. They jump in and they think they know it and they trip, but there's a lot more things to trip over in an industry like this that's coming off of. Yeah. No, I got two questions for you. And I don't know on the business side. One is the tax treatment of a business like this, because it is illegal on the federal level, as well as how these businesses are dealing with the banking system. Because I know it's difficult, like to deposit money. Like banks don't want to deal with you, especially if they're federally chartered, right?
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know which one you want to talk about first, but.
Well, they're pretty much related. I think
Okay.
that, because this is still federally illegal, the government has taken a hands-off approach. So they basically said, if your state has legalized medical, recreational, and they've got regulations around it and they're being enforced, like it's not a priority. So there's not raids, there's not, unless it's like clearly selling out the back door, shipping across state lines, selling the mic. So there's really no fear by most people in the industry of any enforcement by the federal government if you're kind of in the above board processes and industry. But the challenge is, there's a provision in the US tax code that tied to drug sales, and basically it's called 280E, but the dispensaries in particular are the ones most affected, but they can't take common business deductions, tax deductions, that every other business gets. So what happens is their sales are off the roof, their profit margins are great, and then they don't get any type of tax relief.
Paying almost a gross income tax, right?
Yeah, and so their profit margins shrink. So it's very hard. Like people think, oh, people are rolling in millions of dollars. Guess what? If that tax code issue wasn't there, they would be. Right now, that is a serious issue that companies have found ways to thrive even in this unfair situation where you've got 2/3 of the country haven't legalized, but the federal government treats it completely differently. So that's an issue, and that's a big issue that companies deal with. But the thing is, if you get involved now in this environment and you build a strong business that can survive even modestly in this environment, think of what happens when that changes.
Then you get a boost. Huge.
Yeah, I mean, overnight,
you're picking up 30-40% profit.
So there's a lot of plays on the future of how that changes too. And the banking side is tied into this too. Because of that, because it's federally illegal, the big banks won't work with the plant touching companies. Ancillary companies like us, a lot of us have found really strong banking partners, big names, community banks, whatever. But you'll find that the companies touching the plant have a harder time still. It's not the big banks because they're saying they see the opportunity. They're just, we don't want to lose.
Well, they're federally regulated.
Right. And so they for obvious reasons, they've been more reticent to get involved, but more and more banks, local banks, community banks, credit unions have started, servicing the industry, but it's still a constant battle. If you are running a plant touching company you can lose your account at any time. If some higher up in the bank all of a sudden looks and is like, wait, what's this? Okay. We don't want that. Like
compliance, regulatory people.
Legal. Just one person, sees it. Maybe you've been there for 4 years and no one cared. So it's a constant challenge, and you've got to have backup banks and, spread it around a bit. It's getting easier. Like if you look at the landscape of the cannabis industry, this is a $20 billion industry. Like people are hitting banks, right? It's very clear. But this is one of
the money has to go somewhere. They're not keeping it in a safe, and they're
now
in all their
some
stores.
Cases they are, and
probably
they had to. But now it's becoming it's found its way a bit more than it has in the past. But this is a prime example of how you can't just jump in, right? Because you might jump in and you don't know that, or you
have the answers to all these questions, right?
Yeah, and you might not know that. Hey, guess what? Instagram and Facebook, if you do certain things on your account, will take down your account overnight, and maybe and so there's marketing challenges, right? And brand building challenges, and banking and taxes. So it's not for the faint of heart. I mean, it's a difficult industry. It's exciting and it changes quickly. But these are the types of issues right now that it's such a strange, bizarre situation, with the 280E tax issue, with the banking, with everything we've been talking about, that you got to know what you're doing.
Yeah, it's funny because people don't realize even the ancillary side of it. So the banks are regulated. They have reserve requirements. They have all kinds of issues. They can only have a certain amount of cash on hand versus what they're lending out. And if they're a small local bank, credit union, whatever, and they're accepting cannabis money, they might get filled up. It sounds funny, but they might get filled up too quickly. And they can't take any more money from you. You got to find another institute. And that happened, I think, in South Jersey.
Happened. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, because they have too much cash and they have to have a certain amount of money on the street, and they can't lend it out fast enough.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely played out.
Yeah. Okay, well, I appreciate you coming on. I want to definitely stay in touch. I told you that I'm working on a a cannabis series. I'm hoping to connect with maybe 10 or 12 operators where we can do a series, interview them around the country about what's going on in their business, what challenges they faced in their marketplace, where they see the industry going. So I hope you stay in touch with me about that. But I appreciate the insight. I'm in a volatile developing market. I got people going on the CRC website. You know, they have these Zoom meetings with 350 people listening to these people. And like you said, they were coming, you know, beginning of the summer, regulations were coming out at the end of September. That clearly is not going to happen. And we're looking, probably they were saying end of November. I'm thinking it's going to be early spring when they really work out, you know, the kinks and the issues and have applications available. But it'll be interesting to see where it goes, because I think from a medical standpoint, it is a very good thing. And it helps a lot of people who have issues of all kinds, anxiety, depression, cancer, whatever. But, you know, you do have a certain, I mean, it's just a young, developing it's a new thing for us. Maybe it wasn't new for liquor in 1929, 1930, but, you know, when was the last time a drug became legal in this country?
Especially a drug with this much stigma around it. The last thing I'd say really quickly is, you know, if you're out there and you're listening to this, I would say spend 2 hours looking at the industry, spend a half a day, and just see what you think. Even if you're like, cannabis isn't my thing, marijuana, just see what it's all about. Read some of the stuff out there, do a little research, because, and if you choose not to move forward, that, you know, whatever, that's totally fine. At least you briefly looked at it. One of the things you don't want to do is turn back. And I hear people say this all the time. Professional business people, serial entrepreneurs, I wish I had looked at this earlier.
Right.
Take it seriously, right? So as this develops in New Jersey and all these other states, you know, a lot of people are like, I don't even know what that is. I'm not going to look at it. Like, take a look at it and you make your own decision whether you think it's worth another round of due diligence and maybe more thought. But you don't want to turn around and say, this is the biggest opportunity I have seen in my lifetime. I've been in this for 10 years. We took a chance, not from the cannabis background 10 years ago. It was the best decision we have made in our lives. Like,
is it your most successful publication that you have right now?
Oh, it's our
by far.
We put everything into this now. We got rid of the others. I mean, that's the opportunity.
Okay.
I mean, you have 35,000 people coming to a trade show.
That's a big trade show.
1,200 exhibitors, like, and we have, you know, advertisers all over the board. So as all I'm saying is, like, don't just dismiss it. You know, don't just say, I don't know, it's too complicated, it's weird, I'm not a marijuana person.
And you don't, like you said, you don't have to have I hate to use the term, a pot shop. You don't have to be a dispensary or grower. You can participate in the industry without touching the plant, like you said.
Yeah.
So, that's what I would say. And look, I really appreciate you having me on, and I'm excited to see how the New Jersey industry unfolds.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, Chris, I appreciate it very much. Thanks for coming on, and have a great weekend.
Okay, thanks.